Admiral Turner was on his way to bring the 7th Marines to reinforce Guadalcanal and supply the Marines at the same time. Before he left Guadalcanal that day, he asked Gormley for permission to move, and Gormley ducked the issue. "Definite approval cannot be given until present situation is known," he said, but copies of the messages went to Nimitz and King. Admiral King told Nimitz that Turner's request demanded action, and Nimitz sent a sharp message to Gormley. "Turner's request is approved." Gormley roused himself then to try to recover his lost prestige and issued orders to Turner to carry out the mission. He also warned Turner and Vandergrift that a major effort would be made on the night of September 13 by General Kawaguchi to capture the airfield. That night of September 12, as darkness fell on the ridge above Henderson Field, the Japanese began to move about after an afternoon of silence. Colonel Edson's men were dog-tired, and their effective strength was 300 men in those foxholes on the ridge. Behind them was General Vandergrift's command post, and behind that the reserves, consisting of a battalion under Colonel W.J. Whaling, and behind them the artillery with its guns sighted in on the crest of the ridge and the Japanese positions to the south of it. Beyond all the soldiers lay Henderson Field, the prize the Japanese had vowed to secure and the Marines had promised to defend. Japanese troop morale on Guadalcanal had been raised enormously by the bombardment of the night before and the continual train of Japanese planes flying over Guadalcanal that day. That night the reinforced Japanese set out to take the airfield at any cost. As darkness fell, a red rocket shot up from the Japanese lines, and men in the forward line began screaming, "Marine, you die!" The Japanese 90mm mortars behind the ridge coughed, and the mortar shells hummed in and exploded on the ridgeline among the Marine foxholes. The Japanese on the edge of the ridge stood up, and shouting banzai, ran forward with their bayonets, firing as they came. The Marines crouched in their foxholes and fired their rifles on semi-automatic. The popping of Browning automatic rifles was joined by the stitching sound of machine guns, the screaming, the high splat of the .25 caliber Japanese rifles, and the staccato of light Japanese machine guns. The Japanese probed the front of the ridge and got nowhere. Marines killed the enemy right up to and inside their foxholes. The Japanese moved to the right for the next assault, and on the west side of the ridge found an opening, squeezed through and in the darkness outflanked one raider company. Some of the Japanese infiltrated as far back as General Vandergrift's command post before they were shot down. Private First Class. Jim Corzine saw 4 Japanese soldiers setting up a Nambu machine gun on a hilltop, and he rushed at them, bayoneted the gunner, and swung the gun around on the Japanese. He fired, they fired, and he fell dead, but the Japanese were either dead or wounded, and the gun was not put into action. On the right flank of the Marines, the Japanese tried again to surround the forward element. Captain John Sweeney's raider company was cut to pieces in this assault. His troops numbered only a platoon at the end of the Japanese attack, not a company. Major Torgerson's parachutists also took a heavy series of attacks, and in a lull when the Tokyo Express came down again and shelled, the parachutists' position was hit. Louis the Laos appeared over the Marine lines and dropped one of his green flares. Another red flare went up. General Kawaguchi hurled more troops against the ridge, but still the Marines held. As the infantry firing and the movement became intense, the Marine artillery opened up and fired all night long, the whoomph of the 105mm howitzers the loudest sound in the jungle. The Marine telephone lines to the ridge were cut by mortar fire. After that, the Marine howitzers fired at the Japanese by the light of the Japanese rockets, each of which went up over a new unit as it began to attack. Offshore, the cruiser Tenryu appeared again with her train of destroyers, and they began a general bombardment of Henderson Field and the battle area. Shortly before midnight, the Japanese along the ridge line seemed to calm down. Then another red flare went up, and a howling line of skirmishers headed up the ridge against the left flank of the Marines. The artillery behind the line began firing to its left, and the Japanese loaded their mortars with smoke shells and laid down a screen. "Gas attack!" the Japanese screamed, and charged forward, pushing back the Marine left flank. Already the earlier attacks had pushed the right flank to the rear where it had reformed. Now the centre company of Marines was in danger of being cut off, so they were moved back to the last line on the ridge. Behind was the valley, and below that the pathway to the airfield. The Japanese were stopped by the heavy barrage from the 105mm guns, but some men managed to come through it, up the slope, and hurl grenades. They attacked intermittently, unit after unit, but each was sent reeling back. By 2:30 a.m. in the morning, the edge of the Japanese offensive was blunted, and the charges continued, but ever smaller and briefer. The Marine machine guns rattled, and the artillery boomed each time the Japanese moved. As dawn came, the last Japanese charge sent a handful of men to the crest of the hill, where the Marines picked them off. But an officer and 2 men reached General Vandergrift's command post before they were shot down. With morning came casualty reports, and General Vandergrift saw that the parachute battalion was down from the week before, down from 377 officers and men to 165, and the raiders from 750 men to 526. The shelling of the airfield and the Marine positions had been a cover once more for a Japanese troop landing, and 1,700 troops of a 17th Army detachment had joined General Kawaguchi, but too late to be included in the last night's battle. He would need them. He had sent 2,000 men against the Marine lines that night, and more than 600 had been killed and 500 wounded. As the sun rose in the sky and the birds began to sing as if there had been no bloodletting the night before, the Marines counted noses. That night 40 Marines had been killed and 100 wounded on the ridge, and a few others had been killed and wounded along the rest of the perimeter. The Japanese had staged lesser attacks on the bank of the Tanaru River against Colonel McKelvey's force, and another Japanese detachment, circling around in the jungle and thus arriving very late, had attacked on the other flank, where Colonel Bebush's 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marines dealt with them swiftly and mercilessly, aided by 75mm pack howitzers. As the morning sun rose along the ridge, General Geiger sent every available plane into the air to bomb and strafe. The 3 remaining operational Army P-100s were admirably suited for this work, and they flashed in low over the ground, attacking too low as it turned out, because 2 of the fighters were hit by accurate Japanese ground fire and were forced back to the field, their engines out, to make dead stick landings. There was no quarter in this war, and the Japanese bodies, 500 at least, lay in grotesque positions around the ridge and on top of it. The insects moved in, and the heat began to bloat the corpses before noon. The Japanese made no attempt to brave the ridge in daylight, but under General Kawaguchi's orders began to retreat to the headquarters established on the Matanikau River west of Lunga Point. They had to cut a trail through the jungle as they went, and many of the wounded did not survive the rigours of the journey. On the ridge, Colonel Edson's exhausted raiders moved back, while Marines from the reserve advanced to handle the mopping up. Small pockets of Japanese had infiltrated the lines and been caught by daylight, and they sniped and tried to move back as the Marines came up that day. At one point, correspondent Tregaskis heard a strange foreign shout and then a burst of shooting. He walked up to the ridge and found 2 dead Japanese and a dead Marine. 3 Japanese had been flushed out and made a bayonet charge. The sounds Tregaskis had heard were the cries of banzai by the Emperor's soldiers as they launched this suicide charge. 1 Japanese had caught the Marine and spitted him, and was then shot by other Marines, and the 2nd Japanese had been tackled and then shot. A 3rd had gotten away into the jungle, and the rest of the day was similar to that. The Marines moved carefully, but the snipers still caused casualties, and had to be flushed out and killed. It took another 24 hours before the ridge returned to quiet, and the Marines named the ridge then, in the fashion of American fighting men. Bloody Ridge, they called it, and Bloody Ridge it would always be in the annals of the Marines. Long after the Pacific War ended, the myth persisted in America that the Japanese submarine force had accomplished virtually nothing during the war. But the facts were quite the reverse. The Japanese submarines, and particularly the big I-boats, which were superior to the American fleet-class submarines in many respects, were a real menace to the American fleet, and particularly to the American carriers. By the time of the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Saratoga had been torpedoed twice, put out of action each time, and the Yorktown had been sunk by a submarine. The men of the United States Navy did not share the popular belief of the press, but at the beginning of the war the Navy's anti-submarine tactics were ineffective. As of December 7, 1941, a chief petty officer was in charge of anti-submarine warfare in Washington. The sinking of the Yorktown and the 2 torpedoes that struck the Saratoga were largely the result of poor protective tactics, which were demonstrated by the carrier force's inability to sink any of the several submarines that shadowed the task force during the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. One reason that Admiral Fletcher was so gun-shy could be traced to his fear that one of his carriers would be torpedoed, and this belief in the fragility of carriers was shared by Admiral Gormley, who was also reluctant to expose the carrier force to danger. On September 14, however, there was no recourse but to expose the carriers. In spite of Gormley's reluctance, Admiral Turner had been given the green light by Admiral Nimitz to supply and force the American beachhead on Guadalcanal. There was no way to protect the transports except by committing the American carriers and surface warships, since the Cactus Air Force was unable to build reserves in the war of attrition. At 6 o'clock on the morning of September 14, Admiral Turner sailed. The 7th Marine Regiment was aboard 6 transports, and they were escorted by all the cruisers and destroyers that Gormley would let go. Far to the south was the task force that supported the Wasp and the Hornet, but it had to be prepared for action, because there were no other planes. Admiral Turner knew that the combined fleet was circling somewhere north of Guadalcanal, and he charted a crooked course for himself, far to the east of the short approach to Guadalcanal, hoping to avoid detection by the enemy. If he were observed by the enemy, he wanted to seem to be heading anywhere but to Guadalcanal. The ruse was effective, but perhaps by accident, and the combined fleet had been at sea for a week, waiting for the past 3 days for General Kawaguchi to capture the airfields at Guadalcanal. The ships were running low on fuel, really low, and reluctantly Admiral Yamamoto called on them to retire tempora illi from the danger zone to take on oil. The American search planes were operating competently for a change, and made many reports of sightings that were relayed to the naval commands. The Hornet sent a search group out on September 14, but the carriers were then 250 miles south of Guadalcanal, and the Japanese combined fleet was 200 miles north. Since the effective search range of American planes then was 250 miles, they did not come anywhere near the Japanese fleet. On Guadalcanal on September 14, General Vandergrift shifted the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Marine Regiment from Tulagi to the bigger island, since it was apparent that the action was going to concentrate on Guadalcanal. Early that morning, 4 Zero float planes came over the island, perhaps encouraged by the easy success of the other 2 float planes the previous day, but these 4 were pounced on by F-4Fs and shot down. The usual noon bombing raid arrived with the usual results. Early in the afternoon another raid came over the island, 25 Zeros escorting a handful of Betty bombers. The F-4Fs shot down 1 Zero and 1 bomber just before dark. A dozen single-engine bombers struck Henderson Field again. That day, the United States destroyers Hull and Sterett appeared at Lunga Point, escorting 2 transports loaded with supplies for the Bellegourde Marines. They arrived in the morning and the transports began to unload. All was safe during the daylight hours, as the planes from Henderson Field protected the ships in the harbour from Japanese warship incursions and enemy aircraft. At dusk, on September 14, however, the Sterett saw her first action against the Japanese. That bomber attack came in low over the island, and seaplane fighters strafed the ships, and the Sterett's 5-inch guns brought down one of the planes. First, there was an explosion next to the plane, and then a spark and a trail of smoke. It was a beautiful sight, wrote Lieutenant Thomas McWhorter, an officer aboard the Sterett. Soon after that, our target imitated his unfortunate comrades and added his wreckage to the Savo Sound, and the Sterett had drawn closed. The 2 destroyers moved across the channel to anchor in Tulagi Harbour. 3 hours later, down came the Tokyo Express, 1 cruiser and 4 destroyers, to speed along the Guadalcanal side, bombard Henderson Field, and then speed back. They did not pay the slightest bit of attention to the American ships in Tulagi Harbour. The next day, the events were much the same. A heightening of air activity, but no naval activity near Guadalcanal, and the Japanese troops moving back to the area around Taivu Point. As a matter of course, intelligence officers looked over the pieces of Japanese aircraft wreckage that fell on the island. At this time, they discovered that almost all the planes shot down were just off the assembly lines of Japanese aircraft factories. That said something about attrition and also about the Japanese ability to resupply their air forces in a hurry. Observing and questioning the F-4F pilots, intelligence also learned that the skill of the Japanese flyers was on the decrease. Major Smith and Captain Marion Carl, who had walked into Henderson Field after a 5-day sojourn that included rescue by friendly islanders after he had landed in the water, could remember those first encounters with the cream of the Japanese naval air fleets. But the rate of attrition had been so great that the new group of fighter and bomber pilots seemed to be as fresh from the assembly lines as their planes. Around Bloody Ridge, the Marines spent 3 days mopping up after the big battle. The snipers were the worst problem, for having been trapped behind the American lines, they had no real recourse by their standards, but to fight to the death and make every shot count as long as they lived. So the Marines had to keep scouting and clearing out the trees, and they suffered a certain number of casualties and much more inconvenience. South of Guadalcanal, the Hornet and the Wasp were cruising, and the Wasp was surrounded by 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers. A few miles away was the Hornet, accompanied by the battleship North Carolina, 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers. On the morning of September 15, the Combat Air Patrol shot down a Kawanishi 4-engine flying boat, but since the big plane was far beyond visual range of the force and had been detected by radar, no one worried much about having been reported to the Japanese, and also the searches indicated the combined fleet was far away. On September 15, General Kawaguchi sent a reluctant message to Rabaul and the combined fleet. He had met stiff enemy opposite Tortion, he said, and had to abandon the drive on the airfield. Aboard combined fleet flagship Yamamoto, the news was greeted first with disbelief and then with disappointment, and we stamped our feet in bitter anger, said one officer, and Admiral Yamamoto was no better pleased. The army had completely underestimated the enemy and suffered the bitter results of that error. It would take at least a full division of troops to reinforce Guadalcanal and take the airfield. Until the army could supply the troops, there was no point in pursuing the action. Yamamoto turned the combined fleet back and headed for Truk. Flight operations continued all day. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Wasp made ready to launch a new search and combat air patrol. She turned into the wind and slowed down from the 16 knots cruising speed, and she launched 18 dive bombers and 8 fighters. Admiral Noyes did not know that even as the carrier launched her planes, she was being watched by one of Japan's most celebrated submarine captains. He was Commander Takaichi Kinashi in the I-19, who had made his reputation in the first days of the war operating off Malaya. When Commander Kinashi spotted the task force through his periscope, he worked around until he had the Wasp group ahead of him, silhouetted against the Hornet group. That way, if he fired torpedoes and they missed the Wasp group, they would go on through and give him a second chance. Kinashi moved in as close as he could to the Wasp and fired a full spread, 6 torpedoes, from the forward tubes, and 3 of the torpedoes headed directly for the Wasp's course. Captain Forrest P. Sherman, the commander of the Wasp, swung into the turn demanded just then by their base course, and as he did so, lookouts warned that torpedoes were approaching the starboard beam of the ship. Sherman tried to escape by turning right again, but 3 torpedoes struck. The explosions were enormous. The flight deck bucked up, and planes jumped into the air to crash back onto the deck. Planes suspended in the hangar deck fell. Fire broke out in the ammunition and fuel supplies. The water mains forward burst, and the fire could not be fought with water. Captain Sherman turned the Wasp so that the flames and smoke blew aft away from the undamaged parts of the carrier. The ship listed, but the engineers corrected the list and kept her going. All this activity had not really communicated the danger to the Hornet task group. So unprofessional was the American anti-submarine approach. From 6 miles away, no one could fail to see the smoke and flame rising from the deck of the Wasp. But the men aboard the Hornet wondered if perhaps she had not suffered an operational accident. Just then, with no more warning from the protective destroyers than the Wasp had, the Hornet came under attack from the remaining 3 torpedoes of the I-19. As Commander Kinashi had hoped, the 3 that missed the Wasp ran straight on. When the torpedoes neared the Hornet group, the lookout aboard the destroyer Mustin sighted one wake and spread the alarm by voice radio and by hoisting the torpedo warning flag. But the battleship North Carolina had no time to maneuver, and one torpedo struck forward on the port side of the ship. It hit 20 feet below the waterline and killed 5 men instantly. A hole 32 feet long and 18 feet high was torn in the battleship's side, and it seemed she must sink. Certainly one of the old battleships of the Pearl Harbor vintage would have. But the new fast battleships were constructed with many watertight compartments, and although 4 of North Carolina's compartments were flooded, the captain also flooded the nearby forward magazines for safety. The ship could still make 25 knots, and in a few minutes the damage control party adjusted ballast so that the list was gone. Commander Kinashi's 5th torpedo raced across the Hornet formation, and so did the 6th, and the destroyer O'Brien was steaming off the North Carolina's quarter. One of the O'Brien's lookouts saw the 5th torpedo to port and yelled. The bridge responded and swung to the right, so the fish passed just astern of the ship, but at that very second the gunnery officer spotted the 6th torpedo. It was too late to move out of the way, and the 6th torpedo struck the O'Brien in the bow and ripped it open, and it was not a mortal wound, but the O'Brien was badly hurt. So Commander Kinashi had accomplished one of the rare feats of the war. He had expended 6 torpedoes and left 1 carrier burning, 1 battleship crippled, and 1 destroyer crippled. Her back was broken, and she sank on the way home to the United States. Commander Kinashi was not discovered, and the American destroyers rushed to and fro seeking a second submarine, but they found no clues. Much later, United States naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison concluded in his History of United States Naval Operations that the North Carolina and O'Brien had been hit by torpedoes from I-15. This was also assigned in that same southern area, but Admiral Morison misunderstood the Japanese use of submarines. Almost never were 2 submarines in a position to cross paths. The Japanese kept them carefully apart. Morison did suggest that it was barely possible for I-19 to have attacked both carrier groups, and in his defence it must be said that it seemed so nearly impossible that Kinashi could have made such a sweep with 1 spread that any other explanation seemed more reasonable. The carrier force, moreover, was thoroughly occupied in the task of trying to save the Wasp. The fires of hell burned below her decks, and the forecastle was red-hot. No one in the wardroom at the time of explosion could have survived. It was smashed and gutted. Much of officers' country was located directly below the torpedo hits, and men in their bunks had no chance. But up forward men were alive, although cut off from the main part of the ship by fire, smoke, and white-hot metal. On the water, a film of burning gasoline encircled the bow, and many were afraid to leap into the sea, the only possible way of saving themselves. Those who raised the courage made the jump, and some swam successfully beneath the fires. Some men also burned. In fighting the fires, the major trouble was the lack of water pressure, and in the absence of it, the fires gained headway. At 3 o'clock, the carrier was suddenly shaken by an enormous explosion of gas that had built up below deck. The bridge and the island structure was smashed, and the fighter director office, the radar, and the air commander's cubbyhole were all wiped out. On the bridge, Admiral Noyes was thrown flat on the signal deck, his clothes afire, and several officers and men on the port side of the bridge were blown overboard. The Admiral and Captain Sherman survived, and the captain made his way aft to the Battle 2 station to control the rescue effort. As he reached this point, another explosion blew the No. 2 elevator out of its housing and high into the air to crash down onto the flight deck. The carrier burned fiercely, and the hangar deck was turned into a fire pit, and the ready bombs, machine gun bullets, and torpedoes began to explode. After 20 more minutes of distressing effort, Captain Sherman decided that there was no hope and that the ship must be abandoned. He gave the order, and the retreat was remarkably orderly, considering the raging fires and the constant danger of explosion. The injured men were found and taken off, and chiefs searched the wreckage for survivors before leaving the ship. Mattresses, lumber, life preservers, anything that would float, was hurled from the deck to help the men who struggled in the water. The evacuation took an hour. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon before Captain Sherman left the ship. Belatedly, the destroyers were throwing depth charges at submarines. Commander Kinashi had marvelled for a moment at his handiwork, and then slipped silently away beneath their noses. The depth charges did more harm to the survivors in the water than anything else, but after the carrier was evacuated, and all the rescued were picked up by ships of the task force, the statistics showed that of the 2,250 men aboard, about 200 were killed and 375 wounded. All but one of the planes that had just flown off as the torpedo struck were able to land on the Hornet. Considering the extent of the tragedy, Admiral Noyes, Captain Sherman and the men of the Wasp had rallied heroically. If there was a lesson to be learned from the enormous damage done so easily by one submarine in the presence of 13 destroyers, there was also something to be learned about American torpedoes, a lesson that went unremarked that day. The Wasp continued to bum fiercely, and Rear Admiral Norman Scott in the San Francisco, who had taken command when Admiral Noyes was in the water, ordered the destroyer Lansdowne to torpedo and sink the carrier. The Lansdowne fired 5 torpedoes at the Wasp, and all 5 were hits, but only 3 exploded. They did the job, and the Wasp sank that afternoon, 250 miles northwest of Espiritu Santo. When Admiral Gormley received the report of the affair, he suggested that Noyes was at fault for remaining in the same area for a long period of time. The area was 300 miles east-west and 140 miles north-south, and that this hanging around had been the cause of the sinking. But when the report reached Admiral King, who had all year been experiencing the devastation of the German U-boats off the American coast, King knew better than Gormley that the fault lay in the entire American technique of dealing with submarines. Admiral Noyes could not be faulted for the errors of the past, nor could anyone else. An investigation made by Rear Admiral John Shafroth said as much. Admiral Nimitz agreed that no one could be blamed for the loss of the Wasp, but in all this investigation, sight was lost of a matter equally important. Why did 2 United States torpedoes strike but not explode? This was one of the mysteries of the early days of the war, one that would not be solved in 1942 or the next year. At the moment, many other problems seemed far more pressing, especially the fact that as of September 15, 1942, the United States had only one operational carrier in the South Pacific, while as far as Admiral Nimitz knew, the Japanese had 8 carriers available. The United States had 1 battleship available, the Washington, while the Japanese had 9 battleships, including the Musashi and Yamamoto, the most powerful ever built, and the Japanese force of cruisers and destroyers far outnumbered the American. These statistics were enough to give anyone pause. Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet was fueling on the day the Wasp was destroyed. Commander Kinashi wasted no time in surfacing well outside the American task force. He sent the word of his victory and of the course and speed of the 20 remaining warships and the Hornet. But the combined fleet carriers were too far away, and for some reason the Japanese did not choose to take the aggressive stance of earlier times. Japanese post-war writers have suggested that the defeat at Midway had made Yamamoto more cautious, and that was certainly true of the naval staff in Tokyo, which did not urge immediate action. Admiral Turner was seriously worried on September 16 after learning of the sinking of the Wasp, but no one ever accused him of being faint of heart. He was also spurred by a new sense of urgency. That day, Vandergrift's Cactus Air Force was down to 5,000 gallons of aviation gas, not enough supply for a week of limited operation. It was imperative that Henderson Field be resupplied, and in the absence of any definitive information about the enemy combined fleet, Turner decided that any risk must be taken, and he pushed on toward Guadalcanal with the reinforcements and the supplies. He was lucky. The Japanese submarines were not working the waters northeast of Guadalcanal at the moment, and the Japanese Air Force at Rabaul was kept heavily occupied by B-17 raids, which, although they did little damage, did manage to keep the planes busy. While Yamamoto was finishing up with the fueling process in the north, Turner came into Lunga Roads at dawn on September 18. The ships brought the 4,000 fresh troops of the 7th Marine Regiment, plus food, tanks, jeeps, field guns and ammunition. That day, while the transports unloaded, the destroyers Monson and McDonough moved up and down along the shore of Guadalcanal, bombarding all known enemy positions, and the damage was not very great except to Japanese morale. For days the Japanese on the island had talked of the coming victory, but the Kawaguchi force had failed to take the airfield, and the Japanese airplanes had skipped 2 days of bombardings, and now the American ships seemed to have control of the sea. The Japanese ashore on Guadalcanal suffered an enormous reverse in morale, which was not helped by the fact that in bringing the troops in night after night during the first 2 weeks of September, the Japanese transports had not brought enough supplies for them and the existing garrison, and food was running short in the Japanese camps. On the American side, the reverse was true, and the Marines were getting 3 meals a day. Morale had not been higher since the 3rd day of the landing, when the Marines had watched the transports deserting them. The reinforcements were like a shot in the arm, and so were the scores of drums of precious aviation gas. The unit that had suffered more casualties than any of the other Marine units on Guadalcanal was the Paratroop Battalion, which had been hard hit in the desperate fight for Tulagi, and then had helped the raiders hold on Bloody Ridge. The paratroopers were loaded aboard the transports, bound for Noumea and a rest. All day long the transports unloaded and loaded, and then at 8 o'clock that night they pulled out, for Turner knew well that the Knights still belonged to the Japanese Navy. How right he was. His ships left Lunga Roads at 8 o'clock that night, and just after midnight 4 Japanese destroyers showed up to bombard the island, and particularly the airfield once again. This gave a little lift to the Japanese morale, but it would also take a riche and some basic supplies and more troops to meet the growing American force. But even knowing the state of the American carrier force and of the damage to 1 American battleship, the Imperial High Command did not make a move in this vital period in September. Even with the 4,000 new troops and a few tanks brought in to replace those destroyed in the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Marines were in short supply and short of supplies. It seemed probable they would remain that way until something could be done about the air situation, besides simply replacing the fighters destroyed by attrition. Actually, the Japanese were moving into action, and Admiral Yamamoto called more conferences. Admiral Tanaka, who had supervised the piecemeal reinforcement of Guadalcanal, spoke up in disgust and insisted that the army must land at least a division if they wanted to recapture the island and not simply sacrifice Japanese lives. His message got through, and Admiral Yamamoto became a believer, and he told the Imperial General Staff that the army must stop thinking in terms of Guadalcanal as a momentary roadblock to the invasion of Papua and the capture of all New Guinea. If the Japanese did not destroy the American presence at Guadalcanal, Yamamoto told Tokyo, the entire war effort would soon be in jeopardy. The army must divert at least a division from its New Guinea operations, and might have to employ more troops. But it was essential that the struggle for Guadalcanal be won, or the Papua adventure would most certainly end in failure. As if to underscore the importance of victory, Admiral Yamamoto reorganized the striking force of the combined fleet. What Admiral Gormley was worried about was certainly true. The Japanese had an 8-to-1 carrier advantage over the Americans, but until this time Yamamoto had not taken the American threat seriously enough to bring most of them down. In late September, he ordered Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta to come south from Japan to Truk. Kakuta was the commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, and his carriers numbered the 27,500-ton Hiyo and Junyo and the 13,000-ton Zuiho. By Japanese standards, these were light carriers, although 2 of them were as large as the American fleet carriers. These would be added to the 40,000-ton Zuikaku and Shokaku and give Japan a 5-carrier fighting force to add to the battleships and cruisers in the South Pacific. The Americans could not match this strength. Had Yamamoto made these decisions in August, the battle for Guadalcanal might have ended in Japanese victory by the 1st of October. But because of the intricacies of the Japanese system of divided commands, the response to the United States initiative was extremely slow. The Achilles heel of the Japanese military-naval system was this failure to achieve unified command on a theater basis. One of the real strengths of the American system was its opposite approach, Admiral Nimitz was in command of the South Pacific operations, and Army, Air Force, Marines and Navy were all directly responsible to him. He was responsible to Admiral King, who in turn had to answer to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which included the senior officers of all services. To be sure, at Guadalcanal and for the rest of the war in the Pacific, Nimitz struggled with MacArthur for control of operations. But once the control was established by the Joint Chiefs, the Americans operated in general cooperation. As for the Japanese, the cooperation was only at the lowest levels, and became truly operative only when the Japanese forces found themselves in desperate circumstances. Guadalcanal was their most serious challenge to date, but desperation had not yet set in, and so Army and Navy remained aloof from one another, and neither Admiral Yamamoto nor General Hukatake knew more than vaguely what each other was doing about Guadalcanal. Late in September, Yamamoto was preparing for a new operation when word came from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo that the Guadalcanal situation was indeed serious, just as Yamamoto had been saying. Headquarters concluded that it called for temporary abandonment of new moves in Papua and full attention to the Solomons, also just as Yamamoto had also been saying. The Imperial Army 2nd Division was ordered from Java to Rabaul to prepare to assault Guadalcanal in an amphibious landing as early as it could be achieved. Meanwhile, the Japanese did not stop the trickle of reinforcements to Guadalcanal. Virtually every night, the destroyers came down the slot, escorting barges or destroyer transports. 500 men landed one night, 600 the next. By the last week in September, the losses of Bloody Ridge had been more than made up by the Japanese forces, and their headquarters area west of the Matanikau sector had received new guns and ammunition. The food supply was still not keeping up with the size of the force, and that was the major problem. In the air, the last 2 weeks of September, except for the last 2 days, were quiet. The rainy season was at its height, and heavy cloud cover interdicted Japanese attacks against Henderson Field. The Marine and Navy dive bombers took off daily for missions against the Japanese ships coming down the slot, but they also were hampered so badly by weather that in this period they were ineffective. On September 21, Admiral McCain was relieved of command of the South Pacific Air Forces by Admiral Fitch and started back to Washington. McCain was a victim of Admiral King's prejudices and was saved from being sent out to pasture only by Nimitz's and Turner's vigorous defence. Even so, King could not forget that the disaster of Savo Island was caused largely by air search failure, and no matter the reason, McCain was the man responsible. For the next 2 years he would fly a desk as Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington. Although it was a personal tragedy, it was fortunate for the aviators in the field to have in Washington a friend of the fighting men, a man who was more concerned with getting aircraft to the scenes of operations than in shuffling papers. After McCain was relieved and had started homeward, Admiral Nimitz flew to Palmyra on September 24 to meet McCain and question him about the air situation in the South Pacific. Actually, Nimitz wanted much more information than that. The Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas and the Pacific Fleet was on his way to Noumea to find out what was wrong with the Guadalcanal operation that was making it so costly and so ineffectual. An indication of the desperation with which Nimitz considered the air problems in Guadalcanal was his inquiry to McCain regarding possible use of the New Zealand Air Force to be integrated into the American force there. Nimitz did not have planes for the New Zealand pilots. McCain told him the services were so different in discipline and outlook that it would never work. McCain told Nimitz the #1 problem in the South Pacific was aircraft, not pilots. Actually, at that moment, the Cactus Air Force needed pilots, but no one outside, not even McCain, understood the severity of the combat fatigue suffered by virtually every man after these 6 weeks. But McCain did know that planes, parts, and aviation gas had to be on hand and constantly siphoned into Guadalcanal if the island was to be held. In his own leathery way, the wizened McCain got across to Nimitz the need to replace Fletcher, and not just on a few weeks' temporary duty. 2 or 3 of these fights are enough for any one man. A rest will do him good, said the Air Admiral. One of the big problems in the South Pacific had been the relative ineffectiveness of the B-17 bombers that were so successful in Europe. The Japanese Navy had real contempt for the B-17s, and they never hit anything, said one Japanese officer when his ship was under B-17 attack, and while that was not strictly true, the big planes' bombing results were minimal at this stage of the Pacific War. General Millard Harmon, commander of the South Pacific Army Air Force, was trying to work out a new method to better the B-17's bombing. The Navy would have liked to see the B-17s abandoned for other planes, but Harmon said that the Army Air Force had too much invested in the B-17 and simply had to make it work in the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. His current thinking was to bring them down low to bomb, and at low altitudes their size as a target could pose a danger, but that hazard could be reduced by adopting weaving tactics, much like ships zigzagging, until almost on target. McCain had developed a considerable respect for the B-17, but not for the way they were employed. He had seen pictures taken at Rakata Bay, where the big planes had caught 5 seaplanes on the water near their tender. The B-17s came in low and strafed. They destroyed the 5 seaplanes, and one of them attacked the tender, clearing its decks. The bomber was in turn riddled by low-level Japanese anti-aircraft fire, but one of the great virtues of the B-17, like the F-4F, was its tough hide. With 20 or 30 holes as big as saucers, that one B-17 flew back to its base, and Admiral McCain headed for San Diego. When he got there, he talked to Fletcher, as Nimitz had asked him to, and when he reached Washington, he reported back to Nimitz that Fletcher had best have a long rest. Afterwards, McCain could report that Fletcher had virtually said so himself, and McCain also said he had talked to Admiral King on the telephone and asked for 50 high-altitude fighters to be sent to Guadalcanal right away. That was when King began shouting a habit for which he was famous in Maine Navy, the rickety temporary building put up in World War I for an expanding navy, which was still headquarters in 1942. Nimitz headed south toward Noumea, knowing that in McCain he had an ally going to Washington who would try to get every plane possible for the Pacific, and the Fletcher matter had been handled easily. Admiral William Halsey had shown up back at Pearl Harbor a few days before, hale and hearty after 3 months in the hospital, itching to get into action. And Nimitz knew very well that with Halsey in charge of the carrier force in the South Pacific, there would be no need to wonder if his carrier commander was willing to fight. He had not asked McCain about Gormley. That would have been most unseemly, since Gormley was the area commander, but as Nimitz went south, the question of Gormley was paramount in his mind. Admiral Nimitz flew down to Canton Island, and then to Noumea, where he arrived on September 28. He wasted no time, but called a meeting for 4:15 a.m. that same afternoon aboard the USS Argonne, Gormley's flagship. On hand were Admiral Turner, General H. Arnold, Chief of the United States Army Air Corps, General Millard Harmon, and General Sutherland, MacArthur's Chief of Staff. Part of Nimitz's reason for coming down was to wring from MacArthur a greater degree of cooperation than the South Pacific Command was getting from the jealous general. But above that, Nimitz had to get to the bottom of the command and morale problem, and the meeting lasted 4 hours, with Nimitz asking hard questions all the time. He quickly discovered that although Gormley was the commander of the Guadalcanal force, after 2 months he had still not visited the island, and Nimitz's displeasure was obvious. He told Gormley to go to Guadalcanal immediately and see for himself what was happening there. It was not a request, and it was a sharp order, and no detail was too small for Nimitz. He and Gormley discussed coast watchers and torpedo nets, salvage tugs and labour problems, whether to use native labour, Seabees or Army labour battalions for construction of roads and trails on Guadalcanal. Gormley said the Americans had at least prevented the Japanese from landing troops in daylight by barge. Nimitz probed Gormley's ideas for the future, and Gormley made the mistake of saying can't. If the Japanese wanted to make a maximum effort to retake the Solomons, he could not stop them, Gormley said, and Nimitz said nothing. Why, the Japanese might even attack Hawaii, Gormley said, and they were strong enough. The Rabaul area was still alive with troops, maybe 60,000 of them. Nimitz said nothing. Gormley indicated the Japanese might move 75,000 men against Guadalcanal by small boats. But their movement by small boats, you say, has not been successful, Nimitz observed. Gormley was silent, and Nimitz asked about plans, and Gormley replied that until they had Guadalcanal in hand there was no use making plans, and Nimitz said nothing. He remembered that the demand for plans had come from Admiral King in August, and that King was embarrassed because he had been asked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for future plans for the Solomons. If they were not forthcoming, then the Joint Chiefs might well turn to General MacArthur for the next move. MacArthur had plans and had given assurances that he could carry them out. The Nimitz-Gormley meeting broke up, but it was apparent that Nimitz was not pleased. During the next 2 days, Nimitz fulfilled his obligations as Pacific Fleet Commander. He spoke to Admiral Fitch, who had just taken over as land-based air commander and was learning the ropes. He awarded medals, and he inspected the troops at Noumea and Espiritu Santo, and on September 30, Admiral Nimitz went to Guadalcanal to see for himself what was happening, and he almost didn't make it. The young Army B-17 pilot, who was assigned to take the Nimitz party to Guadalcanal, got lost in heavy weather and had no navigator nor any maps aboard. Nimitz's aide, a string saver, had brought along a National Geographic map of the South Pacific, and Captain Ralph Ofsty, Nimitz's air officer, used it as a navigational aid to bring the B-17 into Henderson Field. Nimitz visited with General Vandergrift, who told him his true Boblies, but never gave any sign of quitting. He awarded medals and managed to get up to the marine lines and see for himself what his men were up against. On October 2, he was back in Noumea for one more meeting with Admiral Gormley. At that meeting, Nimitz urged Gormley to take a more aggressive stance. He gave him specific instructions, and then he left Noumea for Pearl Harbor, and he had some heavy thinking to do. Back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz sent messages to Admiral Gormley insisting that Gormley put the fleet at risk, which meant that Gormley was to stop pussyfooting and fight. The Washington was the only battleship in the South Pacific then, and Gormley had sent it out of harm's way. Nimitz said that Task Force 16 must be brought up close to Cape Esperance to protect the transports from Japanese attack. Nimitz also wanted the carrier task force, even though it was reduced to one carrier, to be brought up where it could fight. Even when Nimitz had been on Guadalcanal, the respite of the closing days of September had begun to end. On the island, the Marines encountered Japanese patrols that were obviously probing for information about the American dispositions. On September 30, the Betty bombers were back. The Japanese in Tokyo had begun to pour aircraft into the pipeline for the Navy forces at Rabaul, despite Army opposition to any cutback, even temporary, in their supply of aircraft, which never seemed to get into action. Still, every night the Japanese destroyer transports and barges landed supplies and men. The SBDs bombed them, and the P-100s strafed trucks and troops moving along the new roads the Japanese had built. It was apparent to the pilots that Japanese ground activity had increased in the previous week. On October 2, the coast watchers were caught unaware, and before anyone knew it, 9 bombers and 36 Zeros swept in from the west. The gong rang at Henderson Field, and the American fighter pilots scrambled, but the Japanese fighters caught them from above as they were gaining altitude and shot down 6 of them, while the Americans shot down 4 Zeros. At the end of the day, General Geiger had only 26 operational fighters, and the Japanese at that point had nearly 100 Zeros at Rabaul. The Japanese demonstrated their fighter strength on October 3, when the usual noon bombing raid was escorted by 27 Zeros, but the quality of the pilots was also showing. On this day, the Americans had warning, and they climbed high long before they saw the Japanese, then swooped down on them in the approved diving passes. They shot down 9 Zerosa visiting pilot, Colonel Joseph Bauer, shot down 4 of them, and then 2 more Zeros made the mistake of zooming low across Henderson Field to strafe. Both were shot down by the anti-aircraft gunners. At the end of this day, the picture looked better. 2 American planes were lost, but no pilots. Back at Rabaul, the enormous loss of 10% of the fighter force caused consternation. Admiral Yamamoto from Truk relieved Admiral Tsukahara as commander of the 11th Air Fleet and installed Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka in that post. At Truk, there was at long last a growing feeling of urgency about Guadalcanal. The nightly resupply from Shortland Island was increased, and Admiral Tanaka carried out the mission day after day, although his grumbling about piecemeal reinforcement was heard clearly at Truk. On the ground at Guadalcanal, action was confined to patrols on both sides, but the size and activity increased. In the air and on the sea, however, it was a different struggle, and on the afternoon of October 3, the SBD air searchers found 3 destroyers speeding toward Guadalcanal, something they had not seen for many weeks. Then another group sighted an enemy seaplane tender north of the island, escorted by 6 destroyers. Back at Henderson Field, the bombers were put in the air, and they attacked the seaplane tender Nishin at dusk. But the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were good. They put up such heavy fire that the bombers missed their target. By midnight, the Japanese force was at Cape Esperance and beginning to unload its supplies of tanks, 150mm howitzers, guns, men, and food. The Cactus Air Force launched another attack just before midnight, but since the night was dark and they didn't make contact with the enemy until late, their bombs missed. During the last week of September, General Vandergrift planned a move to envelop the Japanese west of the Matanikau River. On September 23, Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller took his 1st Battalion of the fresh 7th Marines on an expedition that was to move 6 miles southwest of Henderson Field. The Vandergrift staff was operating on the principle that the Japanese had been badly mauled 10 days earlier and would be in no condition to mount a strong defence. But they failed to count on the effectiveness of the nightly resupply program and the high standard of combat readiness of the Japanese reinforcements, all of whom were veterans of previous military action. Colonel Puller's battalion was supposed to cross the Matanikau River, but failed, and on the night of September 26 reached the mouth of the river. The 1st Raider Battalion had gone upstream that day to cross and join Puller. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines was already at the mouth of the Matanikau as reserve. The Raiders made a long march, but the Japanese were waiting for them atop a hill near the bridge where the Americans intended to cross, and they ambushed the force. Lieutenant Colonel S. Griffith, the new commander of the 1st Raiders Red Mike Edson, had been promoted to command the 5th Marines, was wounded in the fierce struggle for that hill, and Major Kenneth Bailey was killed, as were a number of Marines. The Raiders retreated to the mouth of the Matanikau, and 3 companies of the Puller Battalion crossed the river the next day by landing boat, landed between 2 Japanese positions, and were promptly ambushed by the enemy, who got between them and the beach. Surrounded, they suffered many casualties and called for help by spelling out the word with clothing on a grassy meadow. A plane from Henderson Field spotted the help sign and reported by radio to General Vandergrift's headquarters. Colonel Puller then took passage on the seaplane tender Monson and found them not far from the beach. By hand Samar 4, the ship signalled that the Marines should move down the coast, while the Monson covered their retreat with its guns. Under constant fire from Japanese machine guns, mortars, and field pieces, seamen from the Monson brought the Marines off the beach in landing boats. Finally, the Marines had to call Henderson Field for air support to aid the retreat, and by the end of September 28 they were back where they had started, having suffered 60 killed and more than 100 men wounded. At least they had learned that the Japanese had been strongly reinforced. As for General Hyukatake, he still underestimated the Americans. He believed there might be as many as 7,500 United States troops on Guadalcanal, when there were more nearly 20,000. But in order to make fast work of the Americans, the army had decided to use real force and sent in another 15,000-man division, bringing the Japanese force on the island up to about 25,000 men. From the Japanese point of view, the operations of late September and early October were simply holding actions, while they brought in troops from China, Java, and the Philippines to assist in the South Pacific operations. The army had never lost sight of its intention to move in strength against New Guinea, and most of one division would be retained at Rabaul to be used for that purpose as soon as the troublesome gnats were removed from Guadalcanal. Meanwhile, the troops were moving in from the Shortlands, and the major offensive was a few days away. While Admiral Nimitz had been in Noumea, he had authorized Gormley to use any troops he could get to help at Guadalcanal, and from General MacArthur came word that he would send immediately the 164th Regiment of the American Division, a National Guard unit. The additional 3,000 troops would help, so that plan was in the works, and Admiral Gormley made arrangements to send them down by transports, protected by the best force he could muster. There was an increased confidence now too, because in recent weeks the Japanese had been given a thorough working over on the sea anywhere within 250 miles of Guadalcanal that they happened to appear during the daylight hours. The force of bombers in the MacArthur Command had grown much larger, and the bombing had become effective enough that the Japanese could no longer sneer at the B-17s. On October 4, Admiral Yamamoto was ready to move, and that day he issued his operational orders for the invasion and naval and air attack that would drive the Americans off Guadalcanal. General Hyukatake would go to Guadalcanal personally to take over from General Kawaguchi, who had failed to do the job. The general would be accompanied by 22,500 troops of the 2nd Army Division, all of them veterans of Asian action. The first target would be Henderson Field, and after that was taken, the American troops would be fought, defeated and captured until General Vandergrift surrendered. The Japanese had planned it all. Vandergrift's surrender would come on October 15. First, the air attacks by the 11th Air Fleet would be increased even above the high level of the past week. The battleships Congo and Haruna would come to Guadalcanal to bombard the American beachhead, and Admiral Kondo's 2nd Fleet would operate north of Guadalcanal with 3 carriers, while Admiral Nagumo's 3rd Fleet would operate east of the islands with the Shokaku and Zuikaku. The cruiser and destroyer resources of the combined fleet would be available to take whatever action seemed called for. Lieutenant General Maruyama and General Hyukatake were landed with the troops by the Tokyo Express. The increased Japanese activity was a signal to General Vandergrift that a major offensive was coming, so he deployed 6 Marine battalions to secure control of the Matanikau River. But the Americans and the Japanese had the same idea simultaneously, and on October 8, Vandergrift's Marines ran into elements of the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment and flushed them out, marching up the Matanikau to the crossing point called Nippon Bridge. On October 9, the American troops crossed and marched back down the opposite side of the river. Colonel Puller's battalion trapped 1,000 of the troops of the 4th Infantry Regiment in 2 ravines, and when Marine artillery began firing OJ, the Japanese, they tried to escape up the sides of the ravines and ran into Marine machine gun fire. In the battle that day, 700 Japanese soldiers died, and the Marines returned to their lines with casualties of about 200 killed and wounded. The Matanikau area seemed secure, and on October 8 the Japanese seaplane tender Nishin made another trip to Guadalcanal and successfully landed heavy guns, tanks and supplies for the 2nd Division. On October 10, Admiral Kakuta's task force steamed out of Truk with the 3 carriers to support the Guadalcanal recapture, and that night the last of the 2nd Division was landed at Guadalcanal, bringing almost to a par the numbers of American and Japanese troops on the island, although neither side knew it. One reason that Admiral Yamamoto had delayed the combined operation was to secure a new airbase at Buin in southern Bougainville. As Yamamoto knew, one major reason for the high Japanese losses in the air battles of the last 2 months had been the inordinate distance the Japanese planes had to fly to reach the Americans. If a plane was damaged, its chances of making the 500-mile return journey to Rabaul were not good. But with the new fighter bases halfway between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, a much more effective air cover and attack would be possible. From Buin, constant air cover of Japanese operations could be managed on a daily basis. The fighter strip was finished on October 8, and the 11th Air Fleet sent down 30 planes, a combination of Zeros and Ramps, the carrier version of the Zero. From October 5, then, the increase in activity at Guadalcanal had been enormous, with the Japanese sending hundreds of planes to Guadalcanal, the Marines fighting them off, the Japanese landing forces by night, and the Marines trying not very successfully to interdict the landings. On October 9, Admiral Turner sailed from Noumea with the 3,000 troops of the American Division in his flagship Macaulay, with the transport Zeitlin and 8 escorts. Their destination was longer roads, and their schedule called for them to pass north of San Cristobal Island, through Lengo Channel, to arrive at the roads on the morning of October 13. To protect them, Admiral Turner called on 3 task forces, the Hornet's force 180 miles southwest of Guadalcanal, the Washington and her lesser ships 50 miles east of Malaita, and Admiral Norman Scott's cruiser force near Rennell Island. Scott, in particular, was to keep his eye on Cape Esperance, and if any enemy ships showed up, he was to attack them. Scott was traveling in the cruiser San Francisco and had with him the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City and the light cruisers Helena and Boise, and the destroyers Buchanan, Duncan, Laffey, Fahrenholt, and McCalla. The attacks mounted by General Geiger's Cactus Air Force on October 9 and 10 were more than vexing to Admiral Mikawa, and he asked Admiral Kusaka to do something drastic with the 11th Air Fleet to stop the Americans. On October 10, that demand was repeated after 42 American planes attacked the Japanese ships returning from the nightly Tokyo Express run. Not much damage was suffered by the Japanese ships, a few near misses and a few casualties, but Mikawa's exasperation was nearly complete. Since the 11th Air Fleet had failed him, he sent down a task force under the command of Admiral Aritomo Goto to take care of Henderson Field, and he hoped to provide sufficient cover so that the night convoy would not be disturbed. The heavy cruisers Aoba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, and the destroyers Hatsuyuki and Fubuki were to do the job. This was the night scheduled for delivery to Guadalcanal of the last and largest part of the 2nd Division. For once, the American air intelligence system was working better than the Japanese. Admiral Mikawa was totally unaware of the American cruiser force lurking off Cape Esperance. Admiral Scott knew of the presence, destination, course, and speed of the two Japanese forces, the reinforcements and the covering warships. By 6 o'clock that evening, Scott knew that the enemy was less than 100 miles from Savo Island, and he sped 29 knots to catch them. The Americans were ready for action this time. As they sped toward Guadalcanal, the ships came to action battle stations and made ready for the call general quarters that would signal the fight. The Americans came around the western coast of Guadalcanal, and Scott launched 2 of his 4 float planes. The other 2 were lost due to operational mishap, but the 2 that did get into the air headed out to find the enemy. At 10:30 a.m. that night, Scott's ships were 14 miles off Cape Esperance, moving towards Savo to intercept the Japanese. Admiral Goto had warning. When one of the Salt Lake City's float planes was launched, somehow the flares she was carrying caught fire, and the plane burned on top of the water. The flames were visible 50 miles away, where Admiral Goto's cruisers and destroyers were moving down. But when a lookout called attention to the flame, the Admiral and his staff decided it must be a signal from the Japanese troops on the beach. He replied with signal blinkers, but did not really suspect a problem, even when there was no answer. The Japanese were still suffering from an enormous sense of superiority, which seemed quite justified for so far on the sea, except for Midway, which was an aerial fight. They had proved themselves far superior to the Americans. Just before 11 o'clock that night, the Salt Lake City's observation plane reported 3 ships 6 miles from Savo Island. That was about the end of the usefulness of the float planes. One had engine trouble and had to land, and the other found nothing. Admiral Scott kept cruising between Savo Island and Cape Esperance, waiting, and the American force became thoroughly confused. The Helena's radar found a target at 11:08 a.m., but the San Francisco's radar did not pick it up. Scott continued to maneuver, unaware of the closeness of the enemy. At 11:32 a.m. the column turned about, and 10 minutes later the captain of the Helena announced that he had a target 6 miles away, heading northwest. Then the Boise delivered a strange report speaking of bogies, which usually meant aircraft, although her captain was speaking of unidentified ships. The destroyers followed Admiral Scott's maneuvers and came up alongside, except for the Duncan, whose captain got the impression that the other destroyers had seen the enemy as he had, and were attacking. The Duncan staged a lone attack at 30 knots, straight at the radar contacts, so the Duncan was going one way and the rest of the task force another at 11:45 a.m. The American communications got fouled up so that no one seemed to know what anyone else was doing, but at 11:46 a.m. the Helena opened fire on the radar contacts. None of the Americans knew it, but unwittingly they had crossed the T of the Japanese force. Crossing the T is a naval term as old as warfare, and it refers to the use of a ship's guns. When a warship is running south, as the Japanese ships were, its guns trained straight ahead, Only the forward guns can be brought to bear on the target. The ideal position for firing is at right angles to the target, and on the night of October 11, Admiral Goto's ships were moving in a column, and suddenly Admiral Scott's ships crossed the T. Ideally, the United States ships would have stayed in line, which meant every American vessel could bring all its guns to bear on the various Japanese ships, while if the Japanese vessels in the rear fired forward, they might hit one of their own ships. The American position was ideal, actually. Admiral Scott achieved it without even knowing it at the time, or until the battle was reconstructed much later. And in fact, the crossing of the T lasted only a brief time since the various ships began to maneuver independently, a development that would have made Lord Nelson spin in his coffin in St. Paul's Church in London. The Helena's first few shots began to hit the Japanese, and the Salt Lake City found an enemy cruiser on her starboard bow and began firing. The Aoba was hit and the Furutaka was hit, but they began firing back and got a hit on the Salt Lake City that killed a few men. Soon all the American ships were firing on the Japanese, even the destroyers took on the cruisers. The Laffey fired at the Aoba, and the Duncan had steamed full speed ahead into the enemy, and now found herself less than a mile away, with enemy ships closing on both sides of her. Lieutenant Commander E.B. Taylor, captain of the destroyer, tried to get his torpedoes into play, but as he turned, a Japanese shell hit in the No. 1 fire room. Almost immediately other shells began striking the ship. The Duncan did manage to fire 2 torpedoes, but then several shells struck vital parts of the ship, and the next few minutes were marked by a comedy of errors. Admiral Scott decided that his cruisers were firing on American destroyers and ordered a ceasefire. At the same time, Admiral Goto came to the same conclusion, that he had mistakenly engaged his own supply force carrying the troops to Guadalcanal, so he stopped firing. But even as he gave the order, a shell from one of the American cruisers came in and dealt Admiral Goto a mortal wound. Admiral Scott spent the next few minutes trying to find out what was going on. He asked his destroyer commander if he had been shooting at the destroyers. "No," said the commander. 4 minutes passed, however, before Scott ordered his ships to resume fire. He was lucky because most of the gunners had not paid any attention to his orders, and the firing was still going thick and fast. The Aoba and the Furutaka were burning, and the Aoba made a 180-degree turn to the right and headed straight into the American gunfire. She was followed by the Furutaka, and the Kinugasa turned the wrong way by mistake and managed to get out of range and was followed by the destroyer Hatsuyuki. The Duncan was in bad shape, and the United States destroyer Fahrenholt was also taking many shells. Unfortunately, most of the shells that hit her, as well as the Duncan, were American. The San Francisco spotted the destroyer Fubuki less than a mile away and opened fire. Her action was followed by the other cruisers, and in 5 minutes the Fubuki stopped, exploded, and sank. At 11:55 a.m. Admiral Scott became convinced that he was really fighting the enemy, and he looked around, then swung his column of ships to parallel the Japanese. The Japanese and American ships moved side by side, shooting at each other. At midnight, Admiral Scott again ordered his ships to cease firing, but nobody seemed to pay much attention until he ordered all ships to flash recognition lights and assume a column formation. Fahrenholt and Duncan could not, but the others did, and they began to chase the Japanese, and the Japanese fought back. The Kinugasa began firing at the American flagship, but the shells straddled her wake. She sent torpedoes at the Boise, but the American lookout spotted them, and the ship turned hard right, and the torpedoes sped away, and the Aoba got in several hits on the Boise, which began to bum. The Salt Lake City moved up to protect the Boise, and she fired rapidly at the Japanese cruisers and took their attention away from the stricken American ship, and the Boise was in serious trouble. Fires approached her magazines, and the captain ordered them flooded, but all the men at the flood control panel had been killed. She might have gone up in one great blast, except that an enemy shell ripped into her hull and flooded the magazines with seawater, stopping the fire and saving the ship. Half an hour after midnight, the battle was over, and the destroyer Fahrenholt had a bad list, but she was able to move at 20 knots and started back to Noumea. The Duncan was in dreadful shape, and her bridge was askew, and most of the control units there were demolished. Forward, the ship was burning, and the metal was red-hot. Communications were destroyed so that the captain could not communicate with the after part of the ship, and he finally took the men off the bridge section. Many men were still aboard, as the ship steamed in circles at 15 knots. Some of them, led by Lieutenant Herbert R. Cabot, tried to beach the ship, but there was no way to control her, and at 2 o'clock in the morning it was apparent that she was about to go. Ammunition was exploding, and flames covered the whole hull, and those alive abandoned ship. In the water they were beset by sharks, and rescuers from the Macalla had to drive the man-eaters off with rifle fire. But in the end, 80% of the 250 members of the crew were saved. The hulk floated until nearly noon the next day, when she sank to join the dozens of other ships and smaller craft that paved the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Off toward the slot, the Hatsuyuki stood by and took the survivors off Furutaka when it became certain she could not be saved. As dawn came up, the Aoba retired. She had been hit more than 30 times, but she still sped along at highest speed, because the captain feared an American air attack as dawn arrived. She left behind the Fubuki, which sank, but the destroyers Shirayuki and Murakumo returned to rescue survivors and picked up 400 men from the Furutaka and the Fubuki. As this battle was waged, Admiral Tijoshima, commander of the Japanese reinforcement force, landed his men and 150mm guns and stores near Kokumbona on Guadalcanal, and then turned around. There were still many Japanese in the water, and the Americans tried to rescue them. Some refused, but about 110 Japanese sailors were pulled from the water to become prisoners of war. When the night battle ended, the American ships requested Gormley to send air cover at dawn, and the Japanese ships headed back to Shortland Island. At 5:15 a.m. the next morning, 16 bombers and an escort of F-4Fs and some P-39s that had just flown in to help the Cactus Air Force strength took off from Henderson Field, looking for any Japanese ships that might have been crippled or left behind. As they neared Savo Island, they saw a series of oil slicks on the sea with small boats moving around. They saw one destroyer, dead in the water, burning and drifting slowly with the current. She was the Duncan, and circling around her, with boats out, was the Macalla, picking up survivors. The American planes recognized the American ships and did not attack. North of the Russell Islands, the bombers and fighters came upon the Shirayuki and Murakumo, which had stayed behind the cruisers to rescue the survivors of Furutaka and Fubuki, and the American bombers peeled off to attack. The first section missed. The second group scored so near a miss on the Murakumo that the pilots could see it losing oil, which spun out in a long trail behind as the ship speeded up to escape. At 8 o'clock that morning, another group of planes found the two destroyers and attacked again. The F-4Fs came in strafing the two ships, which attracted the attention of the anti-aircraft gunners, while the dive bombers attacked and scored 3 more near misses on the Murakumo. The 6 new torpedo bombers then attacked, 3 at the bow of each destroyer in an inverted V pattern, to give a good chance of a hit, no matter which way the destroyer captain turned his vessel. The attack against the Shirayuki failed, but that against the Murakumo succeeded, and at least one torpedo scored a direct hit. The ship was obviously hit in the boilers, because she came to an abrupt stop and stood, blowing an enormous cloud of steam into the air and smoking from the fires that had been set. She began to list, and by early afternoon she sank, and as the Murakumo was sinking, the Shirayuki sped on northward to escape, and was joined by the Natsugumo. The American planes went back to Henderson and were refueled and rearmed, and in mid-afternoon set out again to find the enemy destroyers. They discovered them just before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 10 dive bombers attacked the ships. The Natsugumo was hit by a bomb amidships, and the bomb must have found either a magazine or a boiler, because the ship blew up and rolled over, but the Shirayuki escaped. Since this battle was the first since Midway in which the Americans had not been roundly defeated, it was hailed in the United States as an enormous victory. The Japanese had lost their oldest cruiser, Furutaka, and one of their oldest destroyers, Fubuki. The cruiser Aoba had to go to Japan for repair, and the United States had lost a modern destroyer. The Duncan, and the cruiser Boise was sent to Philadelphia Navy Yard for repair. The Salt Lake City, also damaged, was repaired at Pearl Harbor. Tactically then, the Battle of Cape Esperance was an American victory. The Japanese were furious with Admiral Goto for failing to note the signs of the presence of an American task force, but there was nothing they could do to him, since his soul had already gone to the Yasukuni shrine. Admiral Mikawa put the blame on Captain Kei Kijima, the successor to command after Goto was mortally wounded, and relieved him, perhaps because he claimed to have sunk 2 heavy American cruisers and a destroyer when he had not. Admiral Scott was the luckiest man in the Navy just then, because the victory concealed the bumbling of his tactics. His claim to have sunk 4 destroyers and 2 cruisers was accepted for a short time. But strategically, the Battle of Cape Esperance was at least a standoff for the Japanese. The Americans had not stopped the landing of the major part of the 2nd Japanese Army Division and its heavy equipment, nor had the Japanese cruiser force stopped the American reinforcement of Guadalcanal. On October 13, at sunrise, Admiral Turner's transports arrived in Lunga Roads bearing that regiment of infantry from the America Division. The Marines were getting more of the help they so desperately needed. The reason that Admiral Mikawa was so angry with the dead Admiral Goto and all of Goto's immediate subordinates for the failure at Cape Esperance was far more than a matter of pique, bad temper, or ego. It was a serious setback to Admiral Yamamoto's Plan X. On October 9, Yamamoto had sent staff officers from the flagship Yamato to Rabaul to give the orders to the 11th Air Fleet, the 8th Fleet, and to the Army, and to answer any questions. Plan X had provided for the combined operations to retake Guadalcanal, and on October 12 the Army would begin shelling the airfield, and so would naval vessels coming in offshore. On October 13 the shelling would be increased dramatically by both Army and Navy. On the 14th, 6 high-speed transports would arrive at Guadalcanal, anchor, and begin unloading supplies and the last men of the Army reinforcement group. On October 15, at 11 o'clock, the transport would finish unloading and move back up Sealark Channel to the Shortlands. At noon, the Japanese Army would begin the operation that would overrun the airfield and force the Americans to surrender. During all this operation, the 11th Air Fleet and all other aviation organizations would make a maximum effort to strike Henderson Field and keep the American aircraft from operating. So Admiral Cato's carelessness had put a monkey wrench in the plan, although in spite of the disgrace of the Cape Esperance defeat, the Japanese Navy had not really suffered much in that engagement, and for the next few days the Japanese reaped an unexpected harvest from it. The damage to 2 American cruisers and 1 destroyer meant that force had to move back to base, leaving Cape Esperance unguarded. The Japanese Navy then was free to continue the build-up for the major battle it was planning. The 2nd and 3rd Japanese fleets had left Truk on October 11 to move north and east of the Solomons. The 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul was ordered to make a maximum effort to destroy the United States air umbrella that covered the slot in the daytime, and this meant knocking out the planes of Henderson Field. On October 12, because of the Cape Esperance defeat, Admiral Yamamoto officially postponed X-Day, but the operation of the Fleet Air Arm and the supply organization continued the same. Admiral Kusaka took his assignment seriously. By this time, the Japanese were well aware of the effectiveness of the Allied coast-watching network. They had tried unsuccessfully to root it out on the ground, but the Australians had built up goodwill with the islanders, who would usually protect or warn them against Japanese land searches, but Kusaka had another means of avoiding raising the alarm. On October 13, he sent the planes on a wide route at high altitude, and when the 27 Betty bombers and 18 Zero fighters came in at noon at 30,000 feet above Henderson Field, General Geiger had only a few minutes to put up 42 F-4Fs, but they were still climbing to reach the bomber level when the bombs began to fall. The bombing was very accurate, putting 13 craters in the runway and destroying much of the mast and mat that was so hard to keep in place. Only this metal matting made the runway usable on wet days by the dive bombers and torpedo bombers. The bombs also burned a 5,000-gallon fuel dump. As the bombers sped away, one F-4F shot down the leader, but was riddled in return, and the pilot, Lieutenant William Freeman, had to ditch the battered plane, and another pilot shot down a Zero. The Marines were refueling the fighters, working over the mast and matting, and moving drums of aviation fuel out of the disaster area. When the second raid of the day arrived, 18 twin-engine bombers and 18 Zeros. Captain Joe Foss and the members of Marine Fighter Squadron 121 had just arrived at Henderson Field 4 days earlier, but they had learned much in those last 96 hours. Operations managed to get a dozen F-4Fs in the air, and Foss led them out, shot down 1-0 and was nearly shot down by 3 others, before he landed at such speed that an ambulance chased him down the fighter strip. The dozen fighters scarcely hindered the Japanese bombers. This raid did more damage and destroyed several aircraft. The pilots agreed that it was the most aggressive and damaging series of raids during all the days they had been at Henderson. Just after dark, a single twin-engine bomber flew across the island, and the anti-aircraft guns pounded, and the Marines' searchlights stabbed the sky to find it. But the plane completed its mission and flew away, but no one knew what the mission was. An hour later, the newly unloaded Japanese 150mm howitzer mortars began to shell Henderson Field and its environs. The destroyers Sterett, Gwyn, and Nicholas were dispatched from the area where Admiral Turner was unloading troops and supplies to the area west of the Matanikau, and they bombarded what they thought was the firing zone. Soon the howitzers were silent. While these events occurred, in the darkness off Guadalcanal, 2 Japanese battleships were coming down the slot. Their target was Henderson Field, and they were instructed to bombard it thoroughly to destroy the American fighters and bombers there. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was in direct charge of the operation. He had nearly 1,000 shells for the 14-inch guns of the Congo and the Haruna. As the ships neared the island, Kurita sent aloft one of his float observation planes. Just before midnight of October 13, the Marines heard the familiar washing machine Charlie as the plane flew over the airfield and Iron Bottom Sound, looking to see that no surprises were lying in wait. At 1 o'clock on October 14, the 8 big guns of Congo and the 8 big guns of Haruna began to fire in a continual roar. The float plane dropped a flare that lighted up the airfield, and observers in the plain and in the mountains gave coordinates to correct the battleship's fire. No part of the airfield was to be untouched this night, Admiral Kurita vowed. The shells started fires in the fuel dumps and blasted one plane after another in the revetments, which were not well hidden. Marines crouched in the slit trenches and tried to duck down even lower. In the next hour and a half, the battleships threw 918 shells at Henderson Field. With this bombardment raging, there was no chance that an aircraft could safely take off and get into the air. Along the shore, Marine and Navy searchlights tried to find the Japanese ships, but the ships were a mile offshore, and the lights and the gunfire from Guadalcanal were totally ineffective. 4 PT boats had recently been brought to Tulagi to assist in the defence against the Tokyo Express, and these went out to fight. They scurried about the fringes of the battleship's destroyer screen, firing machine guns and torpedoes, and although they did not score any hits, the Japanese destroyers were forced to fire back. The PTs also caused Admiral Kurita some concern, but it was only when he had exhausted his allocated ammunition that Kurita finally ended the bombardment at 2:30 a.m. on the morning of October 14 and retired to the north. When dawn came, and the Marines began to count the cost of the bombardment, they found that only 42 planes remained intact of a total of 90 on the field the previous day. Most of the aviation gas had been destroyed, and 41 men had been killed and 100 wounded. That morning, the 150mm howitzers kept the men at the airfield off balance, and then at noon, once again without warning, Japanese bombers arrived and attacked the airfield again. At the end of this raid, General Geiger announced that the bomber airstrip with the Marston matting was out of service until further notice. All planes would have to use the cow pasture that had been used only for the fighters. The fires at Henderson Field burned all the next day, and the Japanese troops on the island gained an enormous boost in morale. They had messages from Yamamoto and 17th Army headquarters to expect more reinforcements and a strong attack on the Americans that next night, and the Americans had the same sort of dispatches. Admiral Gormley estimated that 6 Japanese transports, supported by cruisers and destroyers, would land thousands of troops on Guadalcanal that night. The combined fleet's carriers had been reported 250 miles north of Malaita. Unfortunately, the American carrier force was north of New Caledonia and could not arrive in the area before October 15, and the cruiser force was at Espiritu Santo and could not arrive until the 16th. As Admiral Yamamoto had expected, The combination of air raids and bombardment had destroyed the ability of the Cactus Air Force to control the waters around the island. Before the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Japanese had been unable to bring ships down the slot in the daylight hours, but on October 14 they had no such fear. 6 transports, escorted by destroyers and covered in the air by large flights of Zeros, moved down the slot unopposed. Of the 39 dive bombers that had been on the field on October 13, 4 dive bombers, 3 P-400s and 4 P-39s were all that were left. All the torpedo bombers had been destroyed. At 9:30 a.m. on the morning of October 14, the alarm rang and the fighter planes scrambled. Admiral Kurita's air intelligence had failed in one respect. The little fighter strip had gone unnoticed by the observers, and so of the 42 F-4Fs on the ground on the night of October 13, 29 remained operational. The alarm the next morning came from the coast watchers, but when the fighters got into the air they found nothing, and they came down almost immediately to save precious fuel. Again, the search for every quart of aviation gas on the island was pursued, and what could be found was poured into the fighter tanks. They were still on the ground when the usual noon raid arrived. 26 Betty bombers attacked the main airstrip, tearing more holes, but again they did not seem to see the cow pasture 100 yards away, and the fighters went unnoticed. The leader of this first raid announced to Rabaul that American air strength on Guadalcanal had been completely destroyed, and so when the next raid of 18 bombers came in an hour later, they were careless. The F-4Fs were alerted and waiting in the sky above them. They claimed 9 bombers and 3 Zero fighters. The bombers that escaped did not drop their loads successfully. The raid was a failure. The search planes in the waters north of Guadalcanal found the transports heading fast down the slot, and they also spotted Admiral Mikawa's 8th Fleet, the cruisers Kinugasa and Chokai with 2 destroyers. Without a force of bombers, there was nothing the Americans could do about it. Undoubtedly, the afternoon of October 14 was the low point of the defence of Guadalcanal. Colonel Toby Munn, General Geiger's aide, drove around the airfield to the bomber and army pilots' quarters and warned them that the situation was desperate. The Japanese were sending troop reinforcements and warships to pound the airfield again. If they sent enough troops and did enough damage to the airfield, the Marines might not be able to hold. They had gasoline enough for only one more mission for all the planes. They were to load up the SBDs and the P-400s with bombs and attack the Japanese ships. That would probably be the last mission. Then the aviators would have to join the ground troops in defence of the perimeter. The bombers and the army planes were patched up that day by mechanics who worked under shelling from the Japanese 150mm howitzers on the other side of the island. The mechanics cannibalized one plane after another and drained the gas out of 2 wrecked B-17s. From other wrecked planes and from the slender store of remaining drums, they got enough fuel. At 2:45 a.m., 4 bombers and the 7 army planes took off. They bombed the transport group and did some damage to the destroyer Samidare, but scarcely enough even to slow her down. They were driven off by the umbrella of Zeros, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the cannibal mechanics had managed to put together 9 more bombers. Accompanied by the army planes and fighters, they attacked the transports, but were again driven away by the large force of Zeros, and one of the army planes was shot down. They came back in the dark, and one more army plane crashed on landing, and that was the end of air operations for the day. As darkness covered Guadalcanal, General Vandergrift faced the stark future. The Japanese would land 6 transports full of troops and supplies, and as matters stood, there was no way he could do anything to stop them. He sent a message, whose very bleakness told the story, urgently necessary that this force receive maximum support of air and surface units. At Espiritu Santo, Admiral Fitch received that message and looked over the previous files to add up the difficulties of the Cactus Air Force. He had on hand 8 bombers from the Enterprise Air Group and 9 spare bombers, but no pilots to fly them. He solved the problem by ordering fighter pilots of Marine Fighting 212 to ferry the bombers to Guadalcanal, come back by transport plane, and be prepared to move their fighter planes too, to Guadalcanal at a moment's notice. Aviation gasoline was on its way to Guadalcanal by barges that had been shipped from Espiritu Santo on October 10, each towed by a tug and accompanied by 2 cargo ships and 2 destroyers. But in view of the Japanese control of the sea around Guadalcanal at 1:30 a.m. on the morning of October 14, the commander of the force had told Gormley the danger was too great to continue the journey. Instead, he suggested sending the barges on with the destroyers Vireo and Meredith and the old destroyer seaplane tender McFarland loaded with drums of aviation gas. Fitch accepted that, and also arranged for an airlift to ferry drums of fuel by transport plane from Espiritu Santo starting the next day. So as the night wore on, the wheels were beginning to move, but on Guadalcanal the blackness brought nothing but misery. The Japanese, scenting victory, were stirring, their attack plan called October 15 X-Day, and that was the day the American forces were to be assaulted with enormous force from air, sea, and land. That night of October 14, the howitzers boomed out their deadly messages, and patrols moved along the marine perimeter seeking weak spots. Midnight came, but not quiet. Then, at 2 o'clock on the morning of October 15, the cruisers Chokai and Kinugasa arrived on station, a few hundred yards off Guadalcanal, and began firing their 8-inch guns at the airfield. They fired 750 shells at the field, and under that cover the Japanese transports began unloading their 4,000 troops and more big guns, tanks and ammunition. Dawn came, and with it the sight of the Japanese calmly unloading their transports, while the Americans could do nothing to stop them, and an umbrella of Zero fighters circled overhead. They did not bother to strafe Henderson Field, because Admiral Kurita was sure that he had finally destroyed American air power on Guadalcanal. He was very nearly right, and before the dawn General Geiger counted airplanes, and he had 3 dive bombers that could still fly. 2 of them were filled with gasoline drained from wrecked planes, and one started to taxi up to the head of the cow pasture. No one noticed the crater in the taxi strip, and the dive bomber rolled into it, smashed undercarriage and wing, and was still. The other plane got to the end of the runway, turned, and Pilot Lieutenant Robert Patterson pulled back the throttle and began moving with increasing speed along the ground. But then a wheel caught in an 8-inch shell hole made by one of the guns of those cruisers, and the plane slewed around into a ground loop, which wrecked it beyond repair. Lieutenant Patterson begged to take up the last remaining SBD, and did manage to take off with a bomb load. Although his hydraulic system was leaking, he made an attack, hit one of the transports, and returned safely to the field. The Zeros apparently were so surprised that they paid no attention, but that one SBD on the morning of October 15 represented the striking power of the Cactus Air Force. That morning, General Geiger was beleaguered, but not in despair, and this tough, stocky Marine officer with the heavy crow's feet that marked many hours of looking into the sun from the air was first a Marine, then an officer, and then a pilot. He was prepared to fight as long as there was anything with which to fight. His chief of staff, Colonel Lewis Woods, had been sent off to Espiritu Santo, where he had been promoted to brigadier general and given a command of his own. But on this desperate day someone on the staff recalled that Louis Woods had cached some gasoline around the island. "By God," said General Geiger, "find some." So the staff officer went off to find gasoline drums, and Geiger made him take another officer along, so that if one were killed, someone would know the secret of the caches. They found 200 drums of gasoline on the edge of the marine perimeter, and another 100 on the beach south of Kukum, where they had been unloaded in an enormous hurry in those first days when the transports sat off the beach. They found other caches, and by noon General Geiger had a 2-day supply of aviation gasoline, and life was not quite so desperate as it had been. For General Geiger had been an extremely worried man for the past 10 days. Much later, General Woods returned to Guadalcanal on a visit and found that Geiger was still carrying around a letter he had written about the gasoline caches, unopened. For the moment, the gasoline problem was solved, but what would General Geiger's pilots fly? That morning the mechanics managed to paste together 5 F-4Fs, which strafed the transports with some effect. One pilot shot down a Japanese float plane. Several bombers were patched up well enough to fly, but one at a time, and they went on dangerous single missions that did not prove effective. General Geiger's second aide, Major Jack Cram, had brought 2 torpedoes back to Guadalcanal on his last supply mission in the General's personal PBY. But Cram discovered that all of the torpedo planes were wrecked, and that most of the men of the torpedo squadron had gone off to join the Marines on the perimeter, convinced that the Cactus Air Force was finished. The Japanese could raid Henderson Field at will, and General Geiger had neither the planes nor the gasoline to send fighters up every time bombers came over. The situation was so critical that the order was issued that there would be no scramble unless at least 15 bombers came over. Major Cram had the idea that maybe he could drop the 2 torpedoes from the PBY with a homemade bomb release, and so near desperation was General Geiger that he agreed to the scheme. Cram took the PBY out to attack, accompanied by several dive bombers, whose attack diverted attention from the slow amphibian. Miraculously, he managed to put one of the torpedoes into the side of a transport, and although attacked by several Zeros, he also managed to bring the bullet-battered PBY back to Henderson Field and land without crashing. Admiral Fitch did everything he could that day to help Geiger, and he sent a flight of 11 B-17s from Espiritu Santo, and they bombed one transport successfully. The dive bombers set fire to another, which meant that 3 of the 6 Japanese transports were in trouble. By 2 o'clock on the afternoon of October 15, the Kyushu Maru, Sasako Maru, and Azumason Maru were all afire. Admiral Tanaka took stock. He had unloaded all the troops from all the transports and most of the supplies from the 3 undamaged transports. The American attacks were becoming more frequent and troublesome, so he decided to move out with his undamaged transports and destroyers and leave the 3 burning ships until night. At night he would bring the destroyers back and complete the unloading, so he moved out, and that was the first indication that the Japanese plan to overwhelm Guadalcanal on X-Day had failed. As the day drew to a close, the Americans again counted planes, and they had lost 3 dive bombers, 1 F-4F and 2 P-39s. They had shot down 7 Zeros, the ponderous PBY had torpedoed a ship, and the dive bombers had set another afire. During the afternoon, in spite of Japanese air raids, 3 twin-engine Douglas transports each brought in 12 drums of gasoline. It was not much. A fighter plane used a third of one of those plane loads on a mission, but it was something, and there was something more. 6 of those dive bombers from Espiritu Santo appeared, ferried by the fighter pilots, so the Cactus Air Force was still in operation as night fell. General Geiger had 10 SBDs, put in operational condition by heroic mechanics, 4 P-39s, 3 P-400s, and a handful of fighters, and the major problem of the moment was still fuel. The tug Vireo, the destroyer Meredith, and one of the big gasoline barges were still moving slowly toward Guadalcanal on October 15, although the transports with other supplies had turned back. These vessels were spotted by a Japanese search plane that morning, and just before noon 2 bombers attacked. The convoy was just 75 miles from its destination. The captain of the Meredith decided to continue, but a few minutes later he was informed that 2 Japanese warships were close by. He wanted to reverse course then, but the Vireo was damaged and could not keep up. He ordered the crew to board the destroyer and prepared to sink the tug. As he was making ready to fire the torpedo, a flight of 27 planes from the Japanese carrier Zuikaku attacked and in 5 minutes sank the Meredith with bombs and torpedoes. The Vireo and the barge were abandoned, although a few men from the Meredith managed to get aboard. Tug and barge drifted down towards Sealark Channel. Deserted, the men of the Meredith who had survived the attack took to life rafts, and some in the water clung to the rafts. As in the case of all the ships and planes forced down at sea in the Guadalcanal area, the men faced an immediate and serious danger of shark attack. For over hundreds of years, the Melanesians had disposed of their dead by setting them afloat at sea, and generations of sharks had acquired a taste for human flesh. As with the survivors of the Battle of Savo Island and the Battle of Cape Esperance, the survivors of the Meredith were attacked, and in the end of the 275 men of the Meredith, only 88 survived. That night of October 15, the cruisers Miyoko and Maya visited Guadalcanal and poured 1,500 8-inch shells into Henderson Field. That night, morale reached a new low among the Americans on Guadalcanal. Vandergrift reported the bad news to Gormley, and the Japanese had brought in big guns, bigger than anything Vandergrift had. With these guns, the Japanese could shell any point on the island, including the airfield. The enemy had control of the sea and was now able to move around day or night and shell at will. If this continued, said Vandergrift, he could not hold out forever. General Geiger had told him that there was no use trying to repair planes if they could not get more gas, and no use trying to fly them if the airfield was going to be shelled so heavily. The only effective airstrikes as of the afternoon of the 15th could be launched from Espiritu Santo. That same day, Admiral Fitch reported that he was sending away from Espiritu Santo all merchant ships except one oiler. He could no longer guarantee their safety with the Japanese combined fleet on the move. Admiral Nimitz had some idea of how tough it was in those days, and on October 15 he sent Gormley a message saying that he had sent Admiral Kincaid south with the Enterprise and several capital ships to help. I realize that this is a difficult phase of our campaign, and I have complete faith that we will come out on top. Nimitz also sent King an urgent message calling for the Joint Chiefs to make available major assistance, but even as he sent it, he knew it would never arrive in time. If the battle was to be won, at least the first phase of it must be won with the forces at hand in the South Pacific, and if he could not change troops, he could change commanders. At the early October meetings, Nimitz had not been happy with what he saw of Gormley's handiwork, and he had the feeling that Gormley's heart was not in the battle, that he had given up before he began, and each setback only confirmed in Gormley's mind the impossibility of the Guadalcanal invasion. On October 15, Admiral Gormley sent Nimitz a situation report with a copy to Admiral King, in which he showed his despair. The situation was critical, he said. Aviation gas on Guadalcanal was low. Enemy surface forces were attacking at night with heavy bombardment. The shore-based aircraft contingent had been reduced to a critically low number. Enemy striking forces of an unknown composition were forming south of Truk, and enemy ground forces were infiltrating into Guadalcanal. With the forces available, Gormley could not stop the Japanese if they made a determined effort to break through. He told Nimitz, if ever there was an admission of defeat, Gormley had made it. Nimitz had all the same facts from the intercepts of the desperate messages from Fitch and Vandergrift, but Nimitz expected them all somehow to hold on until help arrived. Admiral Gormley had shaken his confidence as the Japanese prepared for their all-out assault to take the island back from the Americans on the night of October 15. Admiral Nimitz decided to relieve Admiral Gormley. On the night of October 15, after Nimitz had consulted with his staff and made the painful decision to relieve Admiral Gormley, he sent Gormley a message to that effect. After carefully weighing all factors, have decided that talents and previous experience of Halsey can best be applied to the situation by having him take over duties of Commander South Pacific as soon as practicable. I greatly appreciate your loyal and devoted efforts towards this accomplishment of a most difficult task. Admiral Halsey was then en route to Noumea by plane, expecting to take over the task forces at sea. Admiral Murray, with the Hornet Task Group, was on his way to a point northeast of Espiritu Santo to join up with Admiral Kincaid in the Enterprise. Halsey was to take over command of the whole force, and to do so he had brought his old Chief of Staff, Captain Miles Browning, and his intelligence officer, Marine Colonel Julian Brown. The PBY bringing them down arrived at Noumea at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of October 17, and a whaleboat came alongside the plane. Admiral Halsey and his staff stepped in, and an officer immediately handed Halsey a sealed envelope marked Most Secret and Urgent. He tore it open there in the boat, and inside found another envelope marked Secret. Inside were the orders giving him command of the whole South Pacific. Jesus Christ and General Jackson, Halsey exclaimed. This is the hottest potato they ever handed me. He was under no illusion about the task ahead. Nor was he critical of Admiral Gormley's performance. Technically, Gormley was doing everything that had to be done. That could be done. But as Admiral Nimitz knew better than anyone else after that October visit, technical performance was not the highest qualification of a successful battle commander. Gormley had no confidence in the operation, and consequently no confidence in himself or in the ability of his subordinate commanders to accomplish the difficult task set them by Admiral King. Halsey had the quality of self-confidence. He had always had it since the days at the Naval Academy when he was the most popular man in his class. There was something about Halsey that inspired confidence, and if he said it could be done, then men would do it. Halsey took command of the South Pacific on October 18. The military situation was no better than it had been 3 days earlier. On October 16, the destroyer seaplane tender McFarland arrived at Guadalcanal carrying 12 torpedoes for the moribund torpedo bombers, but also crates of 37mm ammunition for General Vandergrift's guns, and above all 40,000 gallons of aviation fuel for Henderson Field. Lieutenant Commander John C. Alderman had not slept well on the voyage over, sitting on that explosive keg, and he was no more comfortable at Guadalcanal either. The ship anchored off the beach at Lunga Point and began discharging gasoline from the ship's tanks into barge tanks. They were still pumping gas at 5 o'clock when someone said he saw a submarine periscope. Skipper Alderman decided to move out of the area for the night and headed away, with the barge still alongside. 50 minutes later, 9 Japanese dive bombers attacked the McFarland, giving Alderman and the crew a terrible fight. The gunners shot down one dive bomber and damaged a second, but the planes blew up the gasoline barge and put a bomb into the ship, luckily at the fantail, where the depth charge racks were located. The bomb blew up Halsey Enter's several depth charges, blew off the rudder, damaged the engines, and threw a cargo of hospital patients into a panic. These were ambulatory patients, men who were suffering from what was once called shell shock or battle fatigue, and they scared easily, and they very nearly disrupted the crew's efforts to save the ship. But Alderman and his men somehow brought them under control and managed to coax the damaged vessel across the channel into Tulagi Harbour, pulled at the end by a tow, and saving that precious aviation gasoline in the tender. Several times each day the Marines at Henderson Field welcomed the R-4D transport planes that shuttled as quickly as possible between Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, bringing precious drums of aviation gas. The submarine Amberjack was loaded with 9,000 gallons of gasoline and 10 tons of aerial bombs and made the voyage. Necessity was obviously the mother of invention. If some of the high command seemed to have given up, the same could not be said of the troops. On October 16 and 17, the Japanese on Guadalcanal were very quiet. General Hyukatake's reinforcements continued to arrive night after night in groups of about 1,000. Although the general was troubled by the beaching of those transports that never could be completely unloaded, and although the bombardment of the Kokumbona area destroyed enough supplies to give him concern, he was busy with his planning. Since the timing for the full-scale attack had been thrown off, X-Day had been allowed to pass and was supplanted by Y-Day. General Hyukatake could not ask for more seasoned troops than he had in General Maruyama's 2nd or Sendai Division from northern Honshu. This division had fought in China and was famous in Japan and infamous in the rest of the world for its Nanjing massacre. General Geiger and Admiral Fitch combined forces with Admiral Murray to try to squelch the Japanese land build-up. On October 16, Geiger sent his 10 operable dive bombers against targets on the island. He also sent the 7 army planes, which were more useful for striking ground targets than for any other purpose. The Cactus Air Force flew 7 ground attack missions that day, with a loss of 1 SBD. The Hornets planes spent most of the day over the island, striking at troop concentrations and supply dumps. Late in the afternoon, as the McFarland had unloaded 20,000 gallons of her gasoline and was being attacked, the dozen fighters of Marine Fighter Squadron 212 flew into Guadalcanal to reinforce Henderson Field. Squadron Commander Joe Bauer saw the Japanese dive bombers attacking the destroyer, went after them, and shot down 4 of them in a few moments before landing at Henderson. On the night of October 16, Pearl Harbor's radio intelligence team intercepted messages indicating that planes from the Japanese carriers Hio and Junyo had been flown into Buka and would attack Guadalcanal on the morning of October 17. So early that day, the F-4Fs of Henderson Field were in the air, and at 7:30 a.m. the Japanese came over, 18 dive bombers and 18 Zeros. The Americans shot down 6 bombers and 4 Zeros, while losing 1 fighter. That night of October 17, Admiral Yamamoto sent the Tokyo Express down the slot once again. 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers anchored off Tassafaronga, and another 5 destroyers anchored off Cape Esperance. Several of them shelled the American positions, including the fighter strip, which they seemed finally to have discovered as a separate entity. The shelling kept the American planes from taking to the air, while several of the Japanese destroyers landed more thousands of troops. Admiral Yamamoto had grown more than a little impatient with the army. when General Hyukatake indicated that he was not quite sure when the big land offensive would take place. The combined fleet had sailed, and the men expected to fight, but instead, after October 11, they were milling around north of the Solomons, waiting for word from the army. Finally, Yamamoto had called off X-Day, and was now awaiting General Hyukatake's indication of the date on which he would be prepared to take Henderson Field. Hyukatake was so pleased with the Navy performance on the night of October 17 that he made the decision. Y-Day would be October 20. On October 17, the Marines were given a hand by the Navy when the destroyers Aaron Ward and Makalu moved in west of Kokumbona in one of the Japanese sectors of the island. And they did to the enemy what the Japanese destroyers, cruisers, and battleships had been doing to the Marines. The two destroyers fired 2,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition at Japanese supply dumps and destroyed large quantities of enemy ammunition and food. General Hyukatake had not yet assessed the damage done by the raid begun by destroyers Aaron Ward and Macalla and augmented by the Cactus Air Force and Hornet planes. The big loss was in transport. Trucks and armoured vehicles and their fuel supplies had been blown sky-high, so many of them that Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi, commander of the 17th Army Artillery, was very much concerned. That same day, October 17, Admiral Nimitz showed how much he was trying to help. He was at last ordering the diversion of some Pacific Fleet submarines to the Guadalcanal area. He also had suggestions. The Japanese combined fleet was dependent on a small number of fleet tankers, and if Admiral Fitch and General MacArthur could send planes after those tankers, it might relieve the pressure. Nimitz was getting a new task group of ships built around the new battleship Indiana, and he sent that straight from the Atlantic through the Panama Canal to the South Pacific. The 25th Army Infantry Division on Oahu was ordered to move south. From the Army, Nimitz got fighter planes and B-17 bombers to augment Fitch's slender forces. They were coming as fast as they could. In this hour of crisis, even General MacArthur seemed to rouse himself from his policy of minimal cooperation. He had resisted employment of the Brisbane-based submarines for tactical purposes at Guadalcanal, but now he would send them. All that Halsey had to do was hold out until the help arrived. Halsey did not need much of Admiral Gormley's time and no more of his advice. He had brought some staff, and he brought in more of his own men, not to denigrate Gormley's, but because his own staff knew his ways, and they had not been contaminated by defeatism. The flagship was the old destroyer tender Argonne, but Halsey moved into the former Japanese consulate and set up his headquarters. On October 18, the word began to move through the fleet and to Guadalcanal. Halsey had come. The morale on the island, never apparently as low as that back at headquarters, received a sudden boost. Halsey was one commander that every Marine and sailor could respect, for he was aggressive and outspoken in his intent to win the war,